My name is Carrie Keene, and I'm going to be your instructor for this module. Today, we are going to talk about sources of real-world data, some of the frameworks being proposed for real-world evidence, and what it means to have real-world data that is fit for purpose. The learning objectives are that we're going to explore different sources of real-world data and describe why we need these different sources of data. We're going to talk about how some of these real-world data differ in the U.S. than from different countries, compared to other countries rather. We're going to examine some of these proposed frameworks for using real-world evidence in medical product development and regulatory decision-making, and then discuss the concept of fit for purpose as it relates to real-world evidence. So let's get started. So this is a diagram that comes out of the book that I recommended, examining the impact of real-world evidence on medical product development. And it's a really nice diagram for a couple of reasons. One is that it provides an illustration of the variety of sources from which we can obtain real-world data. Real-world data can come from insurance claims, it can come from mobile devices, it can come from pharmacy data or surveillance databases. There are mortality databases that have death certificates for people in the US. Social media can be a source of real-world data. So you can see here that there are a variety of sources of real-world data, and this really raises the question of why do we have to have so many different sources of data to generate the real-world evidence that we want to generate? And the reality is that because no single source of real-world data is sufficient to provide us with the real-world evidence that we need. In contrast to European countries, the US has a decentralized and multiple payer health insurance system, healthcare system. We don't have a single payer system. And so in countries that have single payer systems, what you tend to see is one cohesive clinical data collection mechanism that allows for the collection and aggregation of pharmacy data, clinical data, and other clinical outcome data in one place, and registries are generated from these data. And so they don't really need to tap into all these different sources when they have a question that they need answered. It's all encompassed into the central healthcare data collection engine. In the US, we of course do not have a single payer system, and so all of the data that we want to access for real world evidence is located in these different sources. And so we have to tap into different sources based on the purposes of our need for the data. All right, so let's talk in detail about some of these real-world data sources. So when we're talking about sources of real-world data, these are the most common that are discussed, particularly in the readings that I provided to you. Let's start with administrative claims. So administrative claims are insurance claims. Whenever you go to the doctor and you hand them your insurance card, or you go to the pharmacy, or you go to the hospital, and you have an insurance coverage, that clinic or hospital or doctor is going to file a claim with your insurance company to get reimbursed. Those claims data contain a lot of information, and the payers maintain databases of these insurance claims. So you can imagine they are incredibly large and voluminous, and they have a lot of data in them. One of the advantages to these data sets are the large sample sizes and the fact that you can get patient demographics and clinical data. And if a patient stays with an insurance company for a long time, you can get longitudinal data on that person. So there are a lot of benefits to these data. Unfortunately, they are not a complete source of real-world data. Typically, you're not going to get clinical endpoints out of administrative claims data. The data is not collected for research, so they're collecting it for the purposes of paying an insurance claim, not for addressing a research question. And you may have lost a follow-up. So if a patient changes jobs, they may change, or very likely will change, insurance carriers. And if that happens, their insurance claims will go to the other carrier. and you'll have lost a follow-up within the carrier that has the data you may be examining. So not all carriers combine all their data. So again, we have this disaggregate, fragmented insurance data, and it's overall it's incomplete. So then patient medical records. So a lot of patient medical records nowadays are electronic. These are the records that are generated whenever you go to the doctor. So they weigh you, they take your blood pressure, they take your pulse, all of these things, and those go into your health records. So incredibly, we are not 100% electronic when it comes to medical records in the US, but we're getting there. And patient medical records can be a source of real world data, as you can imagine. You get patient demographics and additional clinical data that is not going to be available in administrative claim data. It also may contain the reasons for treatment, why the patient was treated a certain way. Maybe they have particular allergies or comorbidities or lifestyle burdens or what have you. And so it may provide you with the justification behind the treatment that the patient receives. The disadvantages to these data are that they are limited to the points of service, so the clinic or the doctor's office or the hospital. The data may be unstructured. So again, clinics are not collecting data for the purposes of research. They're collecting it for the purposes of treating that patient. The data is also protected as private health information. And so there are limits to accessing these data. There have to be a lot of safeguards involved, and it takes a while, and it's very challenging to access electronic health records. And it's very time intensive if the records are not electronic. So you can imagine trying to abstract the data that you want out of handwritten medical records would be incredibly time consuming and probably not necessarily worth the effort. There are patient generated data. These are the data that we generate with our Fitbits and our Garmin's and our Apple Health apps and all of these data that patients are generating directly. We also, as patients might complete surveys, we might do patient-reported outcomes. And so all of these data provide patient perspective that is unfiltered from the clinician on how we are operating day to day, how we are feeling, how we're handling our disease. And it can typically allow for an assessment of quality of life. The problem is there are no validated tools for doing this, and there's limited generalizability. So if you got access to wearables data, let's say, it's going to be limited to the population who can afford to have a wearable. Now, a lot of people do, but it's not necessarily a general representative patient population. You're also going to be missing demographics and clinical data because we're not necessarily putting that information in our wearables, or if we are, that data is not part of what's collected from them. So these data sets, again, are quite limited. Patient registries are a very specific data collection instrument for a specific disease area or procedure type. For example, there's the National Total Joint Registry, which is specific to joint replacement. Physicians or surgeons opt in to have their data contributed to the registry. There are also heart valve registries and other registries. They are very specific and pretty limited in their scope. The pros are if a disease area you're interested in has a registry, you're going to get some pretty uniformly collected data, assuming that those who have opted in are continuously providing that data. You'll often get longitudinal follow-up on patients, and registries are organized in a way that has research in mind. They anticipate that their data will be used for research. And so if you have a research question about a disease area for which there's a registry, that can be a real advantage because the data has probably been collected in such a way that it will address the question you are trying to answer. You'll also probably get adverse events in the registry data. The problem is there's a lot of missing data. Either it'll be missing from the registry submission or patients will be lost to follow-up. It's also a biased sample of patients, so you have surgeons or doctors who have opted in, and so that means their patients have opted in, and so it's going to be a select group of doctors with a select group of patients. And registries are incredibly costly. They're a lot of work, they're very expensive, and there may be lack of uniform assessment for outcomes. So one surgeon might use one outcome measure, another surgeon might use another. So even though there are uniform data policies, the way things have been measured may differ. All right, and then we come to social media. Obviously, this is what patients are sharing online. It is usually around a specific disease or a treatment experience. The pros to this are that we're getting the patient perspective unfiltered and in their own words, which can be incredibly powerful. You can also get groups of patients who may be spread around the world globally with a rare disease, and you have them essentially all in one place online. And that can be really helpful when you're trying to understand patients with a rare disease, what they're dealing with. The problem is this tends to be limited to qualitative data only. It's not going to be uniform. Some patients will share some things, some patients will share others. You're also not going to get typically demographic and clinical data, certainly not consistently across the social media platform that you're investigating. And there's also always a question of authenticity. Is the person who's putting the data out there really who they say they are? So as you can see, we have all these different sources of data. All of them have pros, cons, advantages, disadvantages, cost, time, benefits, all of these things. So when we're talking about generating real-world evidence, what we're really talking about is aggregating all of these different data sources into one place and making it so that we can analyze that data effectively. All right, so when we're talking about aggregating and analyzing real world data, we're talking about taking data from all those different sources we just talked about and putting them in one place. The diagram on your screen is from the Salford Lung Study. This is also again from the book that I recommended. And what you can see here is that we're attempting to combine real world data from multiple different sources, and this is very challenging. It requires sophisticated systems and analytics, and you have to take into considerations that data may not be formatted or collected the same way. You may have missing or incorrect data. One data set might have great data on one point, and another data set might have not as good data on that data point, but you have to combine them anyway, and you have to find ways to do that. It's also important to keep in mind that adding another bubble to this diagram doesn't make your data set better unless it's the right data. So just adding more data isn't always the answer. Having the right data is what you want. And we're going to talk about that in terms of fit for purpose here in a minute. And essentially, once you have all these data in one place, you need to aggregate them and analyze them to actually address the research question that you have. This is a really challenging process. So looking at Sentinel as an example, these are all the different data points that Sentinel has in it. Again, this is from the book that I recommended, this diagram here. And over on the left, I want you to kind of imagine for a moment that we have three sources of data for which there is gender. So in the data set, it tells you whether the person, the patient, is male or female. But each of the sources codes gender in a different way. So if we look at our little diagram here, the one on the left in red, they code it as gender and it's written out male and female. The middle one is called sex, not gender, and it's coded M for male and F for female. The right-hand one is called sex, but it's coded 0 for male and 1 for female. We now have to use our analytics and aggregate these data and get them coded in such a way that they are consistent. This is part of the challenge. And so here we've decided to code the variable as sex and call it M for male and F for female. It requires data analytics to make that happen. Now, I want you to imagine that you have to do this kind of aggregation for every data point from every source for millions of patients. That's the challenge that we're facing. So when we go back up here to our bubble diagram, every single one of those bubbles around the center box has data points that may or may not be coded the same way, that if they are important to us, need to be aggregated in the same way that we just did here with our very simple example about gender. And then used in, as we see in the Sentinel program here, across different types of data collections. So it's incredibly challenging, very difficult. This is why we are struggling so much in the US to generate real world evidence. Not that other countries aren't struggling. There's a lot of work being done in Europe, in the European Union, and in other countries to make real world data useful. But I think that when we look at the unique challenges we face here in the US, this is one of them. And it's that we have to find ways to aggregate these data meaningfully. I want to touch real quick on the NEST system. This is the National Evaluation System for Health Technology. NEST is sort of this, the answer to Sentinel for medical devices. And it's also sort of the future of what MD EpiNet started out to do. And we talked about MD EpiNet in the module 1, and as you can see, MD EpiNet is now a global private-public partnership. They're focused on certain areas. NEST has now come to the forefront of the work from FDA, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, and other stakeholders to support real-world evidence generation for medical devices. It's just incredibly difficult to generate real-world evidence for medical devices. The way the data is recorded in all of these data sources is very different. There are specific challenges to aggregating information on medical device use. And so the NEST Coordinating Center is attempting to deal with these challenges of having fragmented um, data for medical device use across the US. One of the things that they're doing is these demonstration projects to essentially provide proof of concept that they have developed scalable approaches to evidence generation. So yeah, start small, but it has to be scalable because there's a lot of data out there and of potential utility, but it's all fragmented. And NEST is trying to show how we can bring it all together. They have a strategic plan. They're basically in the midst of it, but by all accounts that I've seen in the presentations from NEST, and I encourage you to go out to their website, they have a lot of great information. They are making good progress. As of the last I heard, NEST has signed agreements with 12 network collaborators that represent 195 hospitals and 494 million patient records. So that's a lot of information. And so now the question is, can they take all those aggregated data and make something out of them similar to the example that we just saw? So NEST is an important program for the future of real world evidence in medical devices. I want to briefly touch on a couple of topics here. One is these frameworks that are coming out for real world data and real world evidence. It's really interesting if you go and just Google some real world evidence information, you'll see that these frameworks are coming out. And I think it's important to understand that the reason why we have these frameworks is the challenges around real world data and real world evidence are big and real, and there's a lot to them. And I think what's happened is certain organizations have said, okay, we're going to frame our part of this in this way, and that's these frameworks that we see coming out. Obviously, we have the FDA framework for the Real World Evidence Program. Their primary focus is generating evidence of safety and effectiveness. They're supporting regulatory decision making with these real world evidence and focus somewhat on adapting clinical trial designs and establishing some data standards. But when it comes to what FDA's main focus is protecting public health. So their framework for real world evidence is focused on safety and effectiveness and regulatory decision making. And that really makes sense. From the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, which interestingly collaborates with FDA on real world evidence, their framework is more about defining what real world data and real world evidence is. You saw in Module 1 that we defined it a certain way based on FDA's language, but if you look across the readings and published papers on real-world evidence, you'll see that there are different definitions depending on who's talking about it. And so Duke is really focused on, let's get a really good consensus-based definition of what these are, and then generate real-world evidence that's fit for purpose. Are we generating data that is appropriate for the purpose for which it's intended to be used? We're going to touch on fit for purpose here in just a moment. Duke is also interested in identifying areas of high priority where they can make a difference in improving the development of real world evidence and then its subsequent use in regulatory decision making. So you can see that their framework is a little more technical focused. Friends of Cancer Research, interestingly, also put out a framework, and their focus is more on what are the real-world endpoints that we're trying to look at. They've developed some pilot projects working towards improving data aggregation and analysis, sort of tackling some of those challenges we talked about, and really curating that data set process. They're also developing some validation frameworks for validating the data that is collected and then taking those data and exploring endpoints that are, again, fit for regulatory purpose. So you can see that there's a bit of a theme here regarding this fit for purpose concept, and we're going to talk about that. These are just 3 frameworks that have been published. There are other programs overseas that are being developed for real-world evidence, and there are a lot of groups working on this, but these are 3 that I thought would be of value to explore. All right, so our final topic is fit for purpose. What do we mean by this? Basically, just like it doesn't make sense to just get more data, you have to get the right data, it doesn't make sense to go through the process of aggregating a bunch of data that isn't going to help you or answer your question. And so the question, the litmus test for that is the data, is the evidence fit for purpose? And how do you figure that out? These diagrams came out of the Duke readings that I recommended for this module. And essentially, is the regulatory objective clear? What do you need the data for? Is it for a submission? Is it for an expanded indication? What is it? Is it for reimbursement? What is the data going to be used for? So that's kind of your first test. And the second is, can the question even be answered with real world evidence? If you can't answer it with real world evidence, there's no reason to go after that data and go through the process of aggregating it and analyzing it. So these need to be the 2 primary questions you ask first is what is it that you're trying to accomplish, and can real world evidence help you accomplish that purpose? The real world data then must also be fit for purpose. So let's say you decide that, yes, real world evidence will help me. I have a discrete and defined objective. Can real world data be used for this? And if it can, is that data relevant? And is it of good quality? So just because you can use real world data doesn't mean you should just grab the first bunch that comes your way. Is that data going to be relevant to your research question? And is it of high enough quality to be of value? And then your overall real world evidence must address the research question. Is it credible? Is it reliable? And is it actionable? Can a regulatory agency actually take action based on the evidence that you've generated from the real world data sources that you used? So I think these diagrams do a really, really nice job of giving you things to think about if real world evidence is something that you want to explore to support your regulatory submission or a regulatory decision. If you can't make an argument that the data or the evidence is fit for purpose, then it's not something that's going to be useful. So this is a really important concept. All right, so in conclusion, real world evidence, real world data, it's complex. Aggregating data from all these different sources is incredibly difficult, as we described. I think it's worth noting that Sentinel and Nest are going to enhance our ability to generate real world evidence for drugs and for devices. It's just going to take a while. I think there's a lot of work to be done. I am optimistic about the utility of what they're trying to do, but it's difficult. There are very real challenges, and creating a sustainable mechanism for gathering these data together is going to be difficult. And then ensuring real world data and is fit for purpose is critical to effective use of your real world evidence, right? So they both have to be fit for purpose. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to achieve their utility in your regulatory decision making.